How y'all doing? I was supposed to be up here right now, but that's all right. I'm gonna do this. Got my notes in the car. Juneteenth. People say, how come we don't celebrate Juneteenth on January 1st, 1863? Because that's when our president at the time, Abraham Lincoln, had signed the Emancipation Proclamation, hence freeing all the slaves in 1863, January 1st, New Year's Day. But it wasn't until 2 years later that somehow the state of Texas and the slaves there and all the people who lived there for some reason didn't get the memo that the slaves had been free. So General Granger was dispatched and he sent troops to ride into Texas, Galveston, Texas, to deliver the news that the slaves had been freed 2 years prior. So you might ask, how come it took them 2 years to get the notice? Well, the notice was sent when it was signed back in 1863. So there was a lot that said, well, how come they didn't get the message? There were some say, in the history and folklore says, well, the Confederate, some rogue Confederate soldiers out there, and they ambushed the Union soldiers that were tasked with delivering the message and were killed, and the message never got there. Then there's others that say that those soldiers that were sent to Texas actually cut a monetary deal with plantation owners to keep the blacks enslaved while they make more money off slave labor through production of crops and other things that were manufactured by slaves back in that time. So nobody, I guess, really knows the true story behind why they didn't get the message until 2 years later. But that's when the whole United States was now able to celebrate. And during that celebration in Texas, when they got the news, there was a big jubilee. Everybody was, just so elated about the news that many people were, dropping everything that they had, and they were going to find loved ones who had been sold into slavery, mainly children. The children who had been sold, many of them were just going, didn't know where they were going, but they were going to find their children that had been sold into slavery. Others, many others, the second thing they wanted to do was become educated. Because as you know, that was denied to African Americans during that time. And at that time, we had only had 5% of African Americans during that time were literate. And they were mainly in the North, New York, Massachusetts. There were a lot of African Americans who could read and write, but they were in the North, in the states that had abolished slavery years earlier. So with that, by 1860, about 40% of us that were literate, and today we're around 97%. So we still got some ways to go. We need to have 100% of African Americans literate. So here is 40 years in Modesto. 40 years in Modesto. Yeah, that's something to be. The longest running in the Central Valley, from Bakersfield to Sacramento and even up. Central Valley, whatever we call the Central Valley. Modesto leads the way in celebrating Juneteenth. That means that folks here in Modesto back in 1971, when the first Juneteenth, or 70, when the first Juneteenth started, 71, were ahead of the game because there were many cities in this area. Only big cities had Juneteenth before, like in Los Angeles, like San Francisco, who is celebrating their 60th Juneteenth. Oakland has an older Juneteenth. But here, there were some very progressive folks in Modesto more than 40 years ago who started the Juneteenth celebration in conjunction with the building of this center. So there was a whole grassroots effort in the community beginning in the early 60s with the West Side Neighborhood Center that was over on Spruce Street originally. And those folks began to meet together to start to plot a foundation for progressive services and community action here on the West Side. So they started meeting in the early 60s. By the mid-60s, they were making plans for this building here and this park. And then through a grant through the United States Department of Housing and Urban Development, the West Side Neighborhood Group was able to come together and get the center built with the assistance of the city of Modesto and the Housing and Urban Development and the West Side Neighborhood Center. This center soon became the pinnacle of the West Side when it was built. And they broke ground, and the center opened in 1969, actually 1971, when it was all said and done. They started building in 69, opened it up in 71, had a Juneteenth celebration, and it's been going on every year since. The only time it hasn't been here was for 2 years when the center was under reconstruction here. They were remodeling the center, and it was done over at Griseda Park 2 years, and now it's back at its home. 40 years later. Yes. There were some progressive people in Modesto, y'all. Progressive people here in Modesto. So give it up for those people who laid the foundation here for the center and for the Juneteenth celebration. Because, you know, in Stockton, the way they way behind Modesto in Juneteenth celebration. You know, Merced, any one of these big cities in the Central Valley, Sacramento, they're in the shadows of Modesto when it comes to celebrating the abolishment of slavery here in the United States that we attribute to Juneteenth, June 19th, 1865. That's when our fellow freedom fighters and former slaves, our descendants, were eventually freed in the state of Texas. Because we all could not be free until those slaves in Texas were freed. So although all the other states were abolished, we were still in shackles mentally for our brothers and sisters in Texas.